L.P. Hartley's character Leo Colston reminds us that the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Well, even though the history of the United States government laid out for us in Chapter 2 is about the history of our country, it's still a country that is removed from us by time, and we won't be able to understand it unless we try to do so within the appropriate historical context. The rationality principle tells us that we must understand the motivations of the people of the time period, and the collective action principle reminds us that we must know how these interests formed into groups. In this section of the lecture, we're going to take a bit of a look at what the colonial life and mind was like as it related to the politics around the Revolution, and then later on we'll take a look at it as it related to the framing of the United States Constitution. But first, the thing that we need to determine when we're talking about early American politics is what groups had a stake and voice in colonial politics. The collective action principle, again, suggests to us that the groups who play a role in establishing policy end up determining what that policy ends up looking like. There is no set of policies more important to American politics than those coming out of the Revolutionary era, especially the Constitution. Now, while again it's important to not paint colonial America and the America of the founding period with the same brush, we can make some general statements about what groups were involved in politics over this sort of 30-year period. And your textbook breaks it down into a number of groups. First, the wealthy merchants and traders in New England. Second, the large southern planters, in particular Virginians. Third, those who held royal lands, office, and patents to engage in business, the so-called royalists. Fourth, the shopkeepers, artisans, and laborers. And fifth, small farmers. Before, lastly, women, natives, and enslaved I can't even say that seriously. Of course, there's almost no representation of these interests in the politics of the time. It's important for us to remember that, though. The policies of the time are only reflecting the interests of those who are allowed political voice, and during this time period, there are many more excluded voices than there were included voices. What would a constitution look like if it truly represented the interests of the majority of the people? Well, we'll never know. That's not the historical reality that we're playing with. Although, it's also equally important to notice that not even all of these relatively elite groups seen here, the property holders in colonial society, were unified in their interests. When we think of where something as fundamental as the birth of our nation, as the push for independence came from, it wasn't groups 4 and 5 up here, as your textbook says. By 1750, there's a pretty severe split in the economic interests of the true elites and the merely property owning. Sure, typical shopkeepers and farmers didn't like the British tax system or the renewed attention that the colonies were receiving from their imperial mother, but they weren't the ones that were driving the call for revolution. Similarly, Group 3, the Royalists, has no real interest in revolution. Really, when we talk about the prevailing political trends and mindsets through the 1750s and up until the 1780s, we're looking at the desires of a true economic elite. We'll touch on the question of what groups benefited from independence and the new constitutional government next week. It's not automatically the same ones that are framing it, and it's entirely possible that the framers benefit more than just themselves. But it's worth noting that, at least according to our text, it's the interests of the top sectors of society that drive early American politics. It will be important for us to reassess whose voice was considered in politics when we get into the founding period, nearly a full generation after the revolutionary time period. But for our first part of Chapter 2, and for a focus on the late colonial era, it's important to note that the revolution, as much as we hold it in high esteem, was in fact a minority revolution, a revolution that was brought on by a very small sector of society. While your textbook puts an emphasis on the economic and class realities of the time period, many other textbooks, including the one that we most recently used in class, James Wilson's American Government, look at the prevailing thoughts in political theory at the time period, defined by the movement known as the Enlightenment. While the major players in colonial politics were, for the most part, not political theorists, as your textbook points out, they were people who were concerned more with their own best interests more than they were with lofty governmental ideas, something that we can pretty quickly be reminded of by the fact that the call for revolution really only ramps up after British policies of salutary neglect disappear in the 1760s. The colonial elite, however, were aware of and heavily influenced by the prevailing thoughts of Enlightenment philosophies, including the following. The first one being the Lockean idea, and to a lesser extent Hobbesian as we acknowledged in class, but it's most heavily associated with Locke, the Lockean idea that governments derive their powers only from the consent of the governed. Our elementary school summary of the founding and revolution was no taxation without representation, and this taps into that spirit. A government action is only valid if it has the support of those that they govern. Second, the increasing push towards codified written law. Now, the idea that laws must be written down and consistently enforced and publicly available in order to be legitimate or fair. When we talked about the so-called building blocks of government earlier, we said that the US government derives its legitimacy from having a written constitution, something that the British system of government lacks. Now, codified law isn't a new notion now, and it wasn't a new notion at the time. It's as old as Hammurabi, as you'll remember from your classes with Miss Chopra, or I guess possibly Mr. Laketa, maybe not. But while the idea of codified, which is to say written and consistent law, was not new, it also wasn't ingrained into the British colonial system. The British law system, British common law, is not based on an established written constitution, but rather on a wide collection of precedents and documents dating all the way back to the Magna Carta. As modern Americans, if you want a general sense of your rights, all you need to do is take a peek at the US Constitution. As a Brit, you're gonna need to go and get yourself a law degree. Thirdly, not only do laws need to be written, but rights need to be written in order to ensure that they will be protected. I'm going to ignore this one for right now because we'll touch on it in a big way in class when we get to the battle over ratification of the Constitution and whether or not a listed Bill of Rights helps or hurts freedom. Fourthly, there was, within the Enlightenment school of thought, a call for a separation of powers. A parliamentary system like the British one rests an awful lot of its authority in the people's legislative branch. In vogue during this time period, though, was the call for a separation of powers not just for multiple branches of government, but for multiple levels of government, a division between the national and the local powers. This school of thought is commonly tied to the philosopher Montesquieu and is often praised as one of the great virtues of the American system. Schoolhouse Rock regales us with the wonder that is our three-ring circus of government, although it is worth pointing out that it's not an infallible system. The more layers of government you have, the more complex the question of authority, who it is that has the right to act with power, becomes. This can lead to problems where there's an emergency or a disaster, and it's unclear how the various levels of government are going to, or supposed to, work together. Lastly, while I've thrown out several articles of faith of the American system here, I want to remind us that the narrative at play here is much more complicated than the freedom narrative that we were fed in elementary school. This story that Americans were under the rule of tyrants and they wanted to be free and were becoming more free is to a certain extent bunk and garbage. The local elites who drove the revolution wanted a system that would be more fitting to their needs and their wants, and many of the driving forces behind the revolution and the first founding had serious qualms about democracy. Let's take a look at some of them. Franklin described democracy as two wolves and a lamb talking to decide what's for lunch. Adams tells us that democracies inherently fight within themselves and will ultimately destroy themselves. And Madison, in his usual long-winded Madisonian way, tells us that democracies are short-lived and violent in their deaths. These are not freedom fighters who are telling us that political equality for all of humanity is our sacred birthright. Jefferson's the only one who's really out there on that limb. These are self-interested reformers who are cautious in what they replace the government with. While they were patriots and pro-revolution to be sure, colonial politics had been pretty good to these three, and they weren't about to hand over the keys to the unwashed masses. Democracy, to quote Kent Brockman of The Simpsons, simply wasn't going to work. Keep this in mind as we look at the US Constitution and point out all of the ways that, for being the crown jewel of democracy, which it absolutely is, many of its provisions were paradoxically undemocratic. One last word that I want to wrap on a little bit before we wrap up this video, and it's a big one here. It's the word liberty. Liberty, the state of being free within society from oppressive restrictions from authority on one's way of life, behavior, or political views. It's the ability to do what one wants without undue interference. In the old textbook for this class, the author puts forth the interesting and bold claim that not only was liberty the defining virtue of the American Revolution, and I think that that's a claim that we can inspect on its own, but that the American Revolution is the only revolution in the history of major political revolutions that has been solely about the virtue of liberty. Those of you who had me for world history will remember the French Revolution had three goals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. There's no illusion about bringing about equality in the American Revolution, though, save that often cited and even more often ignored clause in the Declaration of Independence. There's no push to bring about equality in either the economic or political spheres in the immediate wake of the revolution. Similarly, if we look at the Russian Revolution, the push was for equality at the expense of liberty, certainly not what the American Revolution was about. We'll investigate both aspects of this claim. Did the Americans value liberty, and was the exclusive dedication to that value a unique trait of this nation's revolution? At some length in our upcoming classes, but for right now we're just putting that idea out there for a seat of debate. We'll talk about all these concepts coming up more in class, but that is our brief introduction and a very limited introduction to the colonial life and mindset.